Thank you for joining today. Welcome to Introduction to Regenerative Organizations within Rhythm. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us and be with us here on Zoom. Hopefully we can create a really fun experience today. I know many of you are probably Zoom experts by now and spend a lot of time on Zoom. And so we hope to make this kind of a fun space where we can all interact. My name's Alex, and I'm on the team here at In Rhythm, joined by Jen and Trey, my team members. And today we're really excited to take you on a journey to begin to shift your mindset on how we think about designing and managing organizations, networks, communities, really social systems. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, In Rhythm is a design and management firm really focused on revealing potential in people and in organizations. And so we really take people and organizations on a journey to transform and to see themselves and manage themselves and design themselves as living systems. And so we offer kind of a range of support, everything from really one-on-one operational support to kind of do-it-yourself tools, workbooks that are available free on our website to help people create shifts in their mindsets, behaviors, and practices really towards a regenerative approach. And so today we're really excited for you guys to be with us and really get an introduction to our approach and how we're thinking about these things. And we're excited to introduce Trey Cates, who's our founding director, who's going to be presenting today. And, you know, as we're getting started, I see some of you are already going ahead and doing this, but would love to just know where everyone's calling in from. And, you know, we've got a Denmark crew here. We've got some folks from Ecuador. Would love to just hear where everyone's calling in from and begin to create some connection weaving here today, because I imagine there's a lot of collective wisdom in this room. And with that, Trey, I would love to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, everyone, for investing your time in us and this subject today. We are first want to just show respect and honor for all those who've come before us and continue to work on some of these same subjects and areas where we're all looking to try to create conditions that allow for health and vitality and potential. And I think the beauty of the approach and our desire is we believe in the diversity of all the different unique voices and want to honor those voices in this process. So In Rhythm's approach is one approach, but it's not the approach. And so we want to respect the fact that others may have different ways to approach addressing the challenges of the current system. And but this is our way to begin to engage and support everybody on that journey. And so thank you for being a part of that today as we jump into the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. And we are going to begin. Thumbs up from people telling me you can see my screen. Awesome, thank you. So we're going to look at a few different things today. One is the state of organizations today, looking at trying to introduce a new metaphor for organizations, and then our approach associated with that new metaphor, and then just open it up for conversation and discussion as a part of our ongoing dialogue. We want to begin with a question. What is the most dominant metaphor used to describe organizations today? Feel free to drop your comments in the chat, and we'll just start reflecting a little bit on what people are capturing in the chat. But what do you think the most dominant metaphor for organizations is today? All right, connection, someone says, hierarchy, machine, networked. Great. All these are reflections, some more progressive and thoughtful than others in terms of its design. But we actually think one of the most dominant metaphors today, for sure, is the idea of a machine. And you see it in everything from the way that people organize themselves, the way they communicate. And here's just a couple of examples. One is your business as a machine. Even Inc. magazine went as far as to talk about what are the 4 recipes we can use to produce better health, organizational health in organizations. So it is this idea that there are cogs, and then there are parts, and there are factories, and there are flywheels, all with this idea of utilizing this machine metaphor as a way to communicate what and how we design today. And we even see schools, economies as machines, the educational system as outputting new thinkers, or actually maybe doers, to even economies like the state of Georgia seeing itself in its economic engine. But it's not limited there. We've even used this to describe the human body, where we're describing arms as levers and pulleys, and the heart or the lungs as pumps. So we're beginning to see that ultimately, even the way we communicate about ourselves, biologically, we use a machine metaphor. And then one of the famous thinkers that's in management consulting and business today actually wrote this on one of his blogs. He said, think of yourself as a machine operating within a machine, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. And we're going to spend a lot of time today debunking the idea that we should be thinking about ourselves as a machine, and that we should consider ourselves a part of machines, and that we should be altering the mechanics of that machine. So that's going to be a lot of the work we do today. So with seeing all of this as the most dominant metaphor, what do you think the consequences are of seeing and treating organizations as machines and humans as parts of a machine? Dehumanizing, heartless, burnout. I think you all are the idea of recognizing finite versus infinite, robots. Yes, all of these are consequences. And these consequences are not limited to just one organization. When we approach and use this metaphor and then design accordingly, it impacts all aspects of society. So I want to show you a couple of things. One in particular is how it influences or impacts our environment. We actually believe this Living Planet Index, it shows the lack or the degradedness of diversity across the planet. We believe that's the case because we see the planet and its resources as a machine. We can extract and use it for our whatever purposes that we want. We see employees this way. So Gallup went and did this great survey over many years, and continuing to do this, about the disengagement rate within organizations. We believe that disengagement rate is so high because of us treating people and the systems that they're a part of as machines. And we'll talk more about that. We also see that it's not limited to just that, but we recognize it generationally when we see it across different generations about how they feel engaged at work. It's not surprising that this new generation of millennials coming up feel the least engaged. Why is that the case? And what could we do to change that? We think this is not limited to just biological or social, but even our financial systems. We think the issue of equality is a design issue, and that we've designed things to benefit a few, and as a result, we've got whole nations representing the same wealth as certain individuals. What could we do to consider something different? And then we also know how this impacts equity issues across, jobs and education and justice and race. And even one of our close partners, the Gemini Group, talks about how even this inequity shows up within the United States, in particular, based upon how we've designed laws, that they just didn't happen. They were designed that way. And they were designed with this mechanistic industrial mindset, which sees people as parts, and the consequences thereof is a dehumanization or an inequity that shows up across society. So these are just different laws that were created to continue to segregate and segment. But we also know that all of this design has never really resulted in anything really positive when it comes to social or living systems. We've got governments that can't govern, economies that can't quote unquote economize, corporations that can't incorporate, schools that do not get the essence of learning, investments that don't leave the world better off, consumer goods that don't do good, and healthcare systems that are not caring. So what does it look like for us to change all of this? So we do see this as a design issue. Now, I do want to say and stress that just because it didn't work for human civilization doesn't mean that the mechanistic industrial design isn't applicable or meaningful in some aspects. So we know it's an empowering metaphor. Everything about the industrialization and what we discovered through the Enlightenment allowed us to see things in a way that continue to reveal potential. But we think it's limited in the way that it should be applied. Even Einstein said that when we talk about factors that are complex, too large for us to reduce to simplicity, that in most cases, the scientific method fails. And he uses the weather as an example where we can't even predict that because of all of the complexity and the variability and the variables included in weather. So with that in mind, what we would like to recognize is there's kind of a misnomer and a misunderstanding of how we apply different management systems. And in particular, what we see in the complicated category here is really what works when we think about mechanistic systems. There's predictable inputs, there's a series of steps, and then we have outputs that we can rely upon and predict. And then in a complex series of situations, it's really dense interdependencies. It's nonlinear change, and it becomes quickly unpredictable. So now what's interesting is when we begin to apply this lens to what we're talking about, one is about things we make, and the other is about things we manage. And what we understand is when we apply a whole management process that's really designed for something we make to what we manage, we create an enormous amount of unintended consequences. And I believe the opposite's true as well. When we take great things that we know about how we manage complexity and apply it to complicated things, we also create consequences. So for us today, we're going to dive into a couple of things of better understanding what's complicated or complex. So when you think about this, is this complicated or complex? Put your answers in the chat. Complicated, that's right, right? It's a series of steps, easy to follow. And even though it looks like there's a lot there and there are a lot of different pieces, there's a way to get there. And so, yes, we see this as a complicated set of instructions. Now, when you think about this, is this complicated or complex? That's right, it's complex. It's not the same. There isn't, it's not the same across multiple different contexts, and those contexts have to be considered. And so this is complexity in the best example. And we start to see organizations beginning to say to themselves, what does it look like for us to design around this complexity? From healthcare organizations to school systems are beginning to embrace this approach. But we really want to stress that we believe that the movement in this next age is not one into a digital age or a Facebook age or a millennial age. It really is recognizing this age of complexity. And this age of complexity allows us to then apply an appropriate management response. So we want to offer the appropriate management response from InRhythm's perspective and several of our partners, which is life as a metaphor for how we should design versus a machine. And that's going to then bring about a very different set of approaches. Now, the first thing that may come to mind is kind of the circle of life metaphor. And there are a lot of things beautiful about that Disney portrayal of life, but we really are wanting us to see it a little differently. We want to use Varela and Maturana systems view of life as a way for us to inform this. They did this incredible study around what is life, and they studied the bacteria and then began to recognize some really key insights. And here are a few of their key insights that we take into our view of how we should design. First thing was self-regenerative ability is not located in any one place. So for it to be able to regenerate itself, it wasn't centrally controlled. It also recognized that there was dependency on all the interconnected relationships as a part of the cell, and that life was a holistic or emergent property of all the different interconnections and relationships in that cell, and that each of those relationships were also self-regenerative systems, meaning that they were autopoietic and had the ability to self-regenerate and self-maintain. And it was their holistic approach and research that began to give us views into how life really begins to be seen and begins to emerge in the context of the world that we live in. So with those unique properties of life, we come to this conclusion that life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. And that living is regenerative and regenerative is living. So in essence, what we're saying is that for us to create a regenerative organization, it needs to be an organization based on life, not based on a static machine mechanistic approach, because it is at the center of all that we're doing is creating conditions for life to emerge. So in a living system, that machine design for a complicated context is great because it engineers this best practice. And in a best practice context, we're wanting to reinforce prescriptive structures, but when we apply it to living systems, we degenerate the health of that system. When we apply it to a mechanistic system like manufacturing or creating a product, we actually think it's appropriate. But in a living system, what we want to do is inform that system design based on principles, not best practices, right? Because principles allow us to design with the uniqueness of that context in mind. And then those principles facilitate the idea of flexible frameworks, giving you the creativity and ingenuity to design the way you should design for your context. And we believe that design regenerates the health of the system. Now, what's beautiful about this is we believe one system creates and needs an enormous amount of energy to maintain it. A machine cannot live on its own. It needs energy from the system it's a part of to make it do what it does. But in a living system, that energy is self-regenerating. It's self-maintaining. And so you don't need external energy for that system. The system can maintain itself. And then what we recognize is when we shift from the machine paradigm to the living systems one, it's really a shift in what we see around perspectives and operations. What does it look like for us to design differently when we think about designing around a living system versus a mechanistic one? So all of this sets in line the idea of saying, so what are the principles that we're talking about? These are 6 principles. We won't have time to go in depth about all of them, but holism, interdependence, and uniqueness are the first 3. And it really begins to create awareness around that there are no real parts. Everything, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that there's inherent value in all these relationships, and that each whole within that system is unique and requires the opportunity to bring out that uniqueness. And then the last 3 are evolutionary, nodal, and developmental. And the ability to recognize that the system needs to maintain a dynamic balance in those ever-changing conditions, that all living systems are decentralized and distributed. There isn't command and control in one aspect of the system, and that it's all designed for the growth and health of its members. Means that as an entire ecosystem or living system, there is the opportunity for all to benefit versus just some benefiting in the design. And then to recognize that even some of the greatest designers of all time, Buckminster Fuller said this: work with life-centered principle and the universe pitches in to help. So what we begin to recognize is we think these are more universal principles, things that we believe as we begin to align around, it creates more energy within the system. So I want to pause for a second and just give you guys a chance to reflect. Which principle do you resonate with and why? And feel free to, drop your thoughts in the chat, and just give you a couple of moments to reflect on when you think about all 6 of these principles that we've pulled from living systems. What is it that you think resonates with you, and why does it resonate with you? Great. Someone wrote nodal. Everyone is equal in contributing to the purpose and activities versus hierarchy. Wonderful. Interdependence. Works until one part is in the system gets maybe lazy, greedy. Great. Thank you. Others. Holism. We all need each other. Everything is connected. Interdependence. Thank you, Courtney. Anybody else? Evolutionary. Process most capable of creating and sustaining complex systems. Awesome. Incremental changes we have to face. Awesome. This is the intention here, is for us to begin to resonate around these principles as a means for design. So we use these principles to design, to monitor, and to continue to inspire our process of emergence. The idea of iterating and changing and developing within the context of an organization. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. When we move into from principles, which we just talked about, to facilitating frameworks, there's something unique about our ability to use frameworks as a way to design. And that is it gives us this incredible flexibility and ingenuity. It is in contrast to prescriptive structures. And just as a point to make here, we're not looking to tell people what that needs to look like in the context of their work, only providing a frame for people to ask questions that allow them to design what's most appropriate for them. So this is the intention. If we take best practices and prescriptions and continue doing what we're doing, we're telling everybody they should look all the same because it worked there, it should work here. And we believe in living systems, especially social systems, that's not true. And when we apply that approach, we actually degenerate the health of that system. So what does it look like for us to use a different framework? Before we jump into that, I do want us, in reference to that application, to think about this. So what happens when you apply principles to complicated systems? Incredible frustration, right? Can you imagine trying to put an IKEA desk together with a set of principles? It would probably drive everybody crazy, increase their anxiety levels substantially. You know, if you had to put together those toys I showed earlier and you were just said, be holistic, it would not work for you or for most, right? Now, what's interesting is when we recognize the frustration that comes to that, what happens when we apply the set of instructions or best practices to complex systems? I think it creates the same kind of frustration, right? We know this is not working. We see the challenges in it, yet we continue to do the same thing over and over again. And we become more and more frustrated as a society because our management systems do not work for complexity and living systems. So we need a new kind of framework. So this is a framework that In Rhythm has developed over time. It's been a lot of work with a lot of collaborators where we began to use those principles as a means to develop a framework that can be a design framework, a decision-making framework, and a process framework to allow for creativity and ingenuity to show up for all those who are wanting to design in the context of their project or their organization or their system. So we see context leaning into what's relevant to the people who are coming together. That boundary that we talked about earlier, we begin to bring a view into what does organizational health look like through the lens of energy, information, communication, and networks, recognizing that the interplay of all four of those things create conditions within social systems that allow for people and those organizations to thrive. We want to design structures with those principles to enable the health of the system first and foremost, and then become a platform for the work that we're doing in the world. And then recognize that the work we're doing, all the strategies and the products and the programs and the technology and the tools that we're using is in service to our purpose. It is not at the expense of health, but allows for us to unleash potential and live into the abundance and resilience that we believe can exist as a result of a living system. And this framework we use to support people in their journey of design. And it's really that simple. There's a lot of details that we can dig into, but it provides a frame for people to design around, to play with, as I often say to a lot of different organizations. So with that, it then creates this real opportunity for us to focus on what the shifts and tensions are that we want to support people in. So we want to support people in the shift from best practices to principles, allowing principles to guide evaluation and design, and that solutions are contextually specific. We want to shift from prescriptions to these responsive or flexible frameworks that allow for adaptation and responsiveness to the changing environment. We want to move from this dominance metaphor or principle to an interdependence one. Command and control does not work in us trying to create the conditions for health. It may work to maximize productivity, but that productivity comes at an expense. So, what can we do to think about less about competition and more about cooperation and collaboration as we begin to design together and to recognize the nodalness of our systems, and that we move from prediction, trying to prescribe and ensure an outcome, versus recognizing patterns. And maybe there's something that's even better than what our prediction could even come close to identifying. So what does that look like for us to create the conditions for health and emergence and allow for the productivity that we're all talking about to show up with abundance, but not at the expense of the health of the system? And that we move from extraction as a principle to equity, that people are the true energy of the organization, not money. Money's only a tool to be put to work. And people shouldn't be used as tools, but should be seen as the real energy source. We should be creating conditions for people to thrive in organizations so that what comes out of that is this increased creativity and potential versus limiting or capping that potential. And that we also recognize this centralized power to decentralized empowerment allows for us to distribute power and control to being across the organization, and recognizing there should be many voices, much diversity, and that the intelligence shouldn't be limited to the few. So those are the shifts and tensions and where we would focus our attention. And so then we would say that a regenerative organization really is a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. It is about positioning us into a mindset that this is a living, evolving system, and that all that we're doing is creating the conditions and letting go of the outcomes. And if we as CEOs or managers or entrepreneurs or project leaders or team members could just begin to say, what does it look like to create conditions? I feel like we would be in a better pace to see the outcomes that we all want, but not at the expense of some of the system. So we'll end with this quote, which is one of the famous system scientists of the last century, where she wrote, "The world is a complex, interconnected, and finite ecological, social, psychological, and economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. Our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch." So for us today, the intention is to give you the opportunity to recognize there's a better way. And we think that better way is embracing life as a metaphor in its complexity and using life as a means to support our design and our inspiration. And then to begin to transition away from the mechanistic paradigm and protocols and allow us to begin to envision something more beautiful, more abundant, and I believe has far more potential.